Hey guys, so today we're talking about natural selection. So let's get to it. Now, this is going to start us off talking about evolution, which is our big idea one for AP Biology. Now, this is a really important big idea. We've been doing the other big ideas so far this year. But big idea one is the process of evolution drives the diversity and unity of life. So we'll be talking about that quite a bit. You may have seen this poster in my classroom in the biology room, but you might have learned evolution as change over time in your previous biology classes. And we're going to get a little bit more specific with that. Of course, this is Charles Darwin, who you probably know well. But our AP definition for evolution is going to be a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time with natural selection as its major driving mechanism. So we're going to talk about how natural selection drives evolution, but just know that evolution is a change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. And of course, Darwin didn't know about DNA or protein synthesis, but he did know that organisms do certain things. So we're going to talk about what he said and then how it relates to our current theory of evolution. So Darwin said inheritable variations occur in individuals in a population. So he knew certain traits could be passed on to offspring and that those traits were different in different individuals within a population. So, of course, Darwin's theory is now supported by evidence from many scientific disciplines, but we've kind of refined that theory a little bit. And Darwin also said that due to competition for resources like space or food or light or whatever, individuals with more favorable variations or more favorable phenotypes are more likely to survive and produce more offspring, thus passing on traits to future generations. So that's the simple idea of what he said. We know that variation occurs through meiosis in sexually reproducing organisms, and of course fertilization. We get genetic variation from that as well, and we get a variety of phenotypes from these two processes. So this is going to provide us with many phenotypes and offspring on which natural selection operates. All right, so this is a diagram you might have seen in your first biology class. It's very popular. One of my favorite examples of natural selection is something like antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So we have just a general population of bacteria up here. That's where we're starting. And there can be variation in these types of bacteria. These variations come from mutations. So some mutations are fatal. Like this one has a mutation. It's going to kill the bacteria. It's not going to do any good. Not going to do any harm. Some bacteria will survive and reproduce, though, and so these ones with different mutations are going to survive, and then in each iteration of these generations, we may have more mutations. So more mutations and reproduction occur, some of them which could possibly make the bacteria resistant to an antibiotic. Oh no. So then when we give this population an antibiotic, it'll wipe out all of those who are not resistant, and then the one that is more fit to this particular environment, the one that has the gene for antibiotic resistance, will pass that gene on to its offspring, and thus we have a population that is antibiotic resistant. And this is natural selection right here. All right, so that's why you shouldn't take too many antibiotics. All right, so fitness in biology is a measure of evolutionary success. So the number of surviving offspring left to produce the next generation. Over here, this blue bacteria was the most fit because it was able to survive and reproduce. So we don't want to think of fitness as like somebody who's really good at going to the gym or running marathons. It is measured by reproductive success. Can that individual survive and then pass his or her traits or its traits onto its offspring? Okay, so don't think of the fit guy. An important thing to remember, too, when we're talking about natural selection is a diverse gene pool is vital for the survival of a species because environmental conditions can change. In one situation, an organism that maybe has a certain type of camouflage would be more fit, but then the environment can change, and we'll talk about the peppered moth example, and then that certain phenotype is no longer the best one for the environment. So, very important, individuals do not evolve. I cannot evolve, but populations evolve. So a population of organisms can evolve over time. Individuals themselves do not evolve. So genetic variation in a population can occur through lots of things, through mutation, through genetic drift, through sexual selection, through artificial selection, and we'll talk about those in more detail as we go on with evolution. We want to mention human impact. So humans can impact variation in other organisms by controlling which organisms reproduce. So this is another we're talking about like artificial selection here. This is another way that populations can evolve. And artificial selection is when a reproductive success is determined by human requirements. So we're going to see this a lot in food. We're going to see this a lot in, of course, pets like dogs. Bananas is a great example because the bananas that we will eat or the varieties that we'll see in the store are not the original population that we saw naturally occurring in the wild. And over time, humans have selected the types of bananas, the sweeter ones, the ones with smaller seeds, that they find more desirable to eat. And thus, those banana populations are the ones that we see more often in the world than the original wild types of bananas. All right. So things that can lead to the loss of genetic diversity include inbreeding, a small population size, non-random mating, when there's no migration or there's a net lack of mutations in a population. So we'll talk about those later as well. Now, environments can be more or less stable, and that's going to affect evolutionary rate. So a more stable environment, we're not going to see as much evolutionary rate affected, and then a less stable environment, meaning there's a lot of change in the environment, we'll see different genetic variations that can be selected in each generation, because every generation may have different traits that are better to the environment. Okay, oh, and of course, the peppered moth situation. Now, if you haven't heard this story before the Industrial Revolution, these peppered moths in Europe, the black versions, the darker versions, that phenotype was pretty rare. So there was only a few occurring in any given population. But then after the Industrial Revolution occurred, there was more soot and pollution on the trees, and so these white ones appeared more easily to predators, and the darker ones were better camouflaged. So you notice that when the tree doesn't have soot on it, this white one is probably better fit for the environment because predators are more likely to see the darker one. But when these trees became darker themselves, the black peppered moths became more fit for the environment. These were able to survive and reproduce better, and then the white ones actually went down in number, and that phenotype was less seen in populations. Now it's reversed over time, and it's a really interesting example of how organisms or populations in a certain environment can change due to the differences in the environment. But it's important to remember that phenotypic variations are not directed by the environment. Instead, they occur through random changes in DNA and through new gene combinations. So if they happen to have a trait that is better suited for that environment, potentially that individual will go on to survive, reproduce, and pass it on to their offspring. But the environment is not going to cause these organisms to change. That's important to remember. Okay, so some phenotypic variations significantly increase or decrease fitness. Maybe it'll wipe out the entire organism before it can reproduce. So an example of that is DDT in mosquitoes. So originally there were a few resistant mosquitoes, but when the chemical killed them off, which we sprayed profusely in the United States and in other countries, some of them survived, and then the ones that survived were able to reproduce and pass this unaffected or this resistance to DDT on to their offspring, and then we got a lot of DDT resistant mosquitoes. All right, another example of how variations that can significantly increase or decrease fitness are sickle cell anemia. So sickle cell anemia or sickle cell disease is caused by a single base pair mutation. It's changing one amino acid to another amino acid, but it's going to affect the entire protein. And we're going to get this abnormal hemoglobin protein, so it's an abnormal hemoglobin S, which is actually going to affect the shape of the red blood cell entirely. And remember, these red blood cells and the hemoglobin combined are going to be able to carry oxygen in the body. So if you have two copies of this mutation, so two of these alleles, you're homozygous, you will have sickle cell disease, and it's going to cause these sickle-shaped red blood cells. It's going to make you inefficient at carrying oxygen, and your cells can clump as well, which is bad. And then you can have lots of other side effects such as muscle pain or difficulty walking, and it's a very serious disease. So obviously those individuals, those humans, are not particularly likely to grow up as well and reproduce as much. So what is interesting, however, in environments where there is a high rate of malaria, homozygous individuals that don't have the trait at all are actually at a selective disadvantage as well. So both homozygous individuals who don't have this mutation and homozygous individuals who do have the mutation are both at a selective disadvantage. So in areas where malaria parasite is present, individuals can still get sickle cell disease, and that's bad. But individuals who are homozygous for the normal hemoglobin, they can contract malaria, and so they're at a disadvantage as well. But organisms that are heterozygous for the sickle cell allele are at a selected advantage because they are protected against malaria and they don't get sickle cell disease. It's harder for the parasite so the plasmodium, which is inserted, it's a very complicated life cycle, but it's inserted into your body by the mosquito, saliva, and then it gets in there, goes into your liver, and then it travels to your red blood cells, and eventually goes into your red blood cells and it bursts them. But individuals that have one copy of this sickle cell mutation, instead of having both alleles, they're going to have less sickle cell side effects, but also more protection against the plasmodium parasite that causes malaria. So in the absence of malaria, there is selection against the sickle cell allele, but protection from malaria comes in areas where malaria is endemic. It comes at the cost of more sickle cell disease in the population. So you get this advantage against malaria, but you also have to have sickle cell disease in the population. And so it's interesting to think that a mutation that causes genetic disease can also protect against an infectious disease. So it's an interesting case